The pie chart below shows the distribution of crops harvested from a farmland in a year. If 3,000 tons of millet, is harvested, what amount of beans is harvested? So the question says, what amount of beans is harvested? Now, before we begin to answer the question that the problem demands, let's take a look at the pie chart itself. Now, when you look at the pie chart, so this is how the pie chart looks like. It says for millet has a proportion of 150 degrees out of the whole 360 degrees of the circle. Maize has a proportion of 90 degrees out of the whole 360 degrees. Then beans, we are not given for beans, but we know that others, that is the other harvest, has a proportion of 60 degrees out of the whole 360 degrees of a circle. Now, since we are not given the one for beans, but we know that the sum of angles at a point in a circle is 360 degrees. Now, since we know that, we can find this angle here. So let's call this angle, let's call it x. Now, to find that angle, so we know x plus 60 plus 90, which is for maize, and plus 150 degrees, which is for millet. So we know that the sum of all these angles should be equal to 360 degrees. 360 degrees. This is what we know. Now, when we add 60 plus 90, that's 150, plus 150 will give us 300. So that's going to be x plus 300 equals 360 degrees. So to find x, we deduct 300 from both sides. So minus 300 minus 300. So this crosses out. So you're going to be left with x equals 360 minus 300 would give us 60 degrees. So that tells us that the angle x here must be equal to 60 degrees. So now the whole pie chart seems to be full. So we have all the information on the pie chart. Now let's go back to the question. The question says the pie chart shows the distribution of crops harvested from a farmland in a year. Now, if 3,000 tons of millet is harvested, now this is a very, very important part of the question, of the problem statement, sorry to say. If 3,000 tons of millet is harvested, that is, this is the proportion of millet here. So this is the proportion of millet. So we are told that if the proportion of millet here connotes 3,000, that is, if millet has a proportion of 3,000, then we are told to find what amount of beans is harvested. That is, what is the proportion of beans in the circle. Now, this is the idea. The thing is, we need to know the total harvest. Now, since we do not know the total harvest, let's call C. So let's call the total harvest. Let's call that C. Now, if the total harvest is T, to find the proportion of millet out of the total harvest, we use the degrees we have in the circle here. What I mean is this. Now, millet proportion. So let's say millet proportion. So millet proportion is going to be equal to what? Now, well, from the pie chart, we know that the proportion of millet in the pie chart is 150 degrees out of 360 degrees. So that is, millet proportion is 150 degrees out of 360 degrees. So the proportion of millet is going to be this of the total harvest. So this is going to be the proportion of millet of the total harvest. And we've been told that this proportion equals 3,000. So that is, this must be equal to 3,000. Now we'll use this information to find T. So this is going to be 150 divided by 360. Well, the meaning of is times. And then you have your T equals 3,000. So this is something as 150 times T, which is 150 T divided by 360. So this equals 3,000. So to find T, you cross multiply. So you have 150 T equals 3000 times 360. And then to find t, we divide both sides by 150 by 150. So this goes off. Then 150 in 3000 will give you 20, and 20 times 360 is going to give you 7,200. 7,200. So in other words, the total harvest, that is T, which is the total harvest, is 7,200. Now we know the total harvest. Let's now go back to the question. It says, what amount of beans is harvested? So we need to know the proportion of beans in this circle based on the number of harvest. Now let's go back. So from the circle here, we know that in terms of degrees, the proportion of beans is 60 degrees out of 360 degrees. So we would use that information to find the proportion of beans in terms of the harvest now, not in terms of the degrees. So the beans proportion must be equal to, so we said the proportion of beans in terms of degrees is 60 degrees out of 360 degrees. So in terms of degrees is 60 degrees out of 360 degrees. But in terms of harvest, we need to multiply this by the total harvest, that is by T. So this is going to be the beans proportion in terms of the harvest. And this is just the same thing as 60 divided by 360 degrees. Now we know off is the same thing as times, and we've obtained our T here to be 7,200. So this is going to be 7,200, and 360 in 7,200 is actually 20, and 60 times 20 is going to give you 1,200. So this is going to be 1,200 tons. So the beans proportion in terms of the harvest this time around is 1,200 out of the 7,200. But in terms of degrees, the proportion of beans is 60 degrees out of 360 degrees. But the question does not demand we find the proportion in terms of degrees, but instead it demands we find proportion in terms of the harvest, which is 1,200 tons. And this is our solution, 1,200 tons.